Who will be the next 2,000-yard rusher? I'm Gabe with Franchise Tag, and today I'm going to be going into the flip side of the last solo video I did, which was on 2,000-yard receivers. And I'm going to be looking into the history of the 2,000-yard rushing seasons that have happened, and who I think may be able to do it in the near future if it is possible in the near future. Now, obviously, rushing was much more prevalent in the older NFL, and in that receiving video, I kind of talked about when the NFL switched to be more of a receiving league. And nowadays, it is definitely a pass first league. So receiving numbers are typically pretty high. And, last season, we didn't even see a running back crack 1,500 yards. The leading rusher in the league was Christian McCaffrey, who ran for 1,459 yards. And then before that, it was Derrick Henry, who had 1,100, and Kyron Williams, who had 1,100. So we only had one running back over 1,200 yards last season. So I'm going to kind of look into, like I said, the history of those 2,000-yard rushing seasons, and then see if it's possible who I think could do it. And we'll start with the oldest season that we will be discussing, which is O.J. Simpson in 1973, with the first 2,000-yard season in NFL history in a 14-game season, so very impressive, where he ran for 2,003 yards. Then 11 years later, in 1984, Eric Dickerson set the current NFL record with over 2,100 yards at 2,105. Then in 1997 and 98, we saw Barry Sanders and Terrell Davis go for 2,053 and 2,008 yards, respectively. Then we get to the 2000s. In 2003, Jamal Lewis goes for 2,066 yards. Chris Johnson, nicknamed CJ2K, for his 2009 season, where he ran for 2,006 yards. Then in 2012, we had Adrian Peterson run for 2,097 yards, currently sitting at second place all time, just 8 yards shy of the record. And then the most recent 2,000-yard campaign came 8 years after AP's, with Derrick Henry running for 2,027 yards in 2020, which I think is, maybe not the most impressive feat on this list, but it is definitely very, very impressive for a guy in the prime of NFL passing to be able to crack 2,000 yards on the ground. Throughout this video, I'm going to talk about all 8 of these seasons in different lights, and I'm going to be kind of going through like a little snake. So this time I went, 73 to 2020. Now I'm going to be talking about Derrick Henry first. Derrick Henry, in the final game of his 2,000-yard campaign, ran for 250 yards and had a season-high 34 carries. Adrian Peterson in 2012, very similar finish. He ran for 199 yards in his last game on another season-high 34 carries to crack the 2,000-yard mark. Chris Johnson, again, had a season-high carry count in the final game of the season. He had 36 carries, only 134 yards, so a pretty inefficient game for him there. And he cracked 2,000 yards by 6. So he barely got over the 2,000-yard mark and did it with a very, very large carry count in the final game of the season. Jamal Lewis did not have a season high in carries in the final game, but did finish very strong. He had 205 yards in week 16 and 114 in week 17, with another week 17 performance leading to the 2,000-yard mark. Terrell Davis had 178 yards in week 17 to get him to 2,000. Barry had 184 in week 17 to get over 2K. And the only name on the entire list that didn't crack 2,000 yards in the final game was Eric Dickerson, who put up 215 yards in week 15, which put him at 2007. And this is before 17-week seasons. So that's the difference between that was the second to last game that cracked 2,000. And then O.J. Simpson, he had 219 yards and then 200 yards in the final 2 games of his shortened 14-game season. So cracked 200 yards in both of the final performances to barely get over 2,000. Regardless, Adrian Peterson won the MVP that year, so his is still very impressive. I'm not ripping on him at all. I'm not dogging on him at all. And then obviously with the ACL injury the year before, that was just a really impressive performance from Adrian Peterson. And then OJ, 14-game season. So even though he did have those 2 crazy games at the end, he kind of had to. He didn't have as many games as everybody else. But my point with all of these is durability is huge. It's a massive point. If you want to get to 2,000 yards as a running back, you need to be playing in all 17 games now. You need to be playing in every game in the season in the past. And you really need to be able to take a heavy load towards the end of the season. You need to be able to take 30 carries in the last game and still be semi-efficient with them. Like We saw Chris Johnson obviously not have the craziest game. 134 yards on 36 carries is not anything to really write home about. But still, cracking 100 yards in the final game of the season with a season high in carries, you need some stamina. You need to be durable. You need to not have any injuries bogging you down throughout the season. The next thing I want to get into is the O line, because that's obviously a very important part of the run game. And continuing that zigzag pattern we have going on, starting with OJ Simpson again, he had a Pro Bowl left tackle, an All Pro left guard, a future Hall of Fame right guard, and then a very lackluster receiving core. 0 players cracked 500 yards, and a quarterback who had a 4-10 touchdown to interception ratio. Uh, so he kind of had to produce. He was definitely the force on that offense. No good receivers, not a good quarterback, a decent to solid offensive line. Uh, and so you kind of expect somebody in that situation to be given a lot of carries and to be producing at a high level. And that's what happened. Eric Dickerson had a second team All Pro left tackle, a Pro Bowl left guard, a Pro Bowl center, a right guard who had been to 3 Pro Bowls by the 84 season and would go to 3 more, plus have an All Pro season. And then a right tackle who was filling in for the future Hall of Famer that they had for 7 games that season. Dickerson was also on a Rams team that didn't have a lethal passing attack, but with him and OJ, I think that was just kind of the offenses of the time. Not having a crazy passing attack was not detrimental in the same way that it would be today. Barry did not have a great O-line, but nobody on the line started less than 14 games, and the passing attack was fairly good. So that's kind of uh, different from the past two, where, no crazy O-line talent and a pretty good passing game with 2 1,000-yard receivers. He seems to be a bit of an anomaly here, but, that's just Barry. Terrell Davis had a Pro Bowl left tackle, left guard, and center. His entire O-line played the whole season together. And then once again, he joins Barry as a 2,000-yard running back on a team with a solid passing attack. Again, 2 1,000-yard receivers there. Jamal Lewis had Jonathan Ogden at left tackle, but nobody else super notable on the O-line. But again, everybody started together, started at least 13 games. That's a vast majority of the season. And as for the passing attack, that kind of gets back to that Eric Dickerson, OJ Simpson theme, where the Ravens' leading receiver had 693 yards and was tight end Todd Heap, who was a baller, but he was also a very capable blocker. So I think that can help with the run game a lot. Chris Johnson, CJ Tuke, had a left tackle coming off an All-Pro season, a Pro Bowl and future Hall of Fame center, and again a consistent O-line. Everybody starting at least 15 games. The Titans' passing attack was also bottom half of the league, and they ranked 5th in rushing attempts and 2nd in rushing yards. So this was a team that was focused on the run and had an at least capable offensive line that had the chemistry and spent the time together to succeed. Adrian Peterson had a Pro Bowl left tackle, and not one O lineman missed a game that year for the Vikings. Combine that with Christian Ponder's bottom 5 performance for pass yardage with under 3,000 yards, despite starting all 16 games. And we're kind of seeing a situation that's happened before, and the situation for 2,000-yard running backs is starting to take shape. And then last, but most certainly not least, Derrick Henry, no Pro Bowl offensive lineman, 2 receivers in the 1,000-yard ballpark, 984 and 1075, and that was Corey Davis and A.J. Brown, I believe. I don't have that written down, so apologies if I'm wrong. And then a middle of the pack QB with Ryan Tannehill. I wouldn't say he's great. I wouldn't say he was bad by any means, especially in 2020. I would like to get into kind of the point of the video of who can do it now. And like in the wide receivers video, I'll set a couple criteria that I want these players to meet to narrow down the options so that I'm not just going through every running back and saying if they can or can't. So age is a big thing. Only 2 people over 28 have cracked 1,700 yards. One of them was Barry, shout out, but he's Barry. So everyone 29 and older is out in my book. For durability, you need to be able to carry the ball at least 320 times, because that was the lowest, I think, was in the 330s, and you cannot be missing any games. So to set a number, I would say you would need to have played at least 10 games every season that you've played. Most of these guys started 14 plus every season. Adrian Peterson started 12 the season before because of his ACL and MCL. And then OJ started less than 12 a few times, but they're 14 game seasons, so it's kind of almost expected if he's missing any games to start fewer than 12. And then the final thing that's kind of a given, but no backfield competition. You need to be the surefire RB1. You need to be taking almost all of the carries. You can't have a running back by committee. You can't have any of that. It's got to be you and nobody else. So I'm going to separate out the backs that fit those 3 criteria and then look at the situations they're in, and then we'll go from there and see who's the most likely. First back I want to talk about is Jonathan Taylor, who technically didn't play enough games the past season to crack my durability metric, but he was sitting out due to his contract, not due to injury. So I'm going to kind of overlook that and say that he can do it. And then Saquon Barkley, who has some injury history, and that's another thing where I'm kind of skirting the rules on that. But we'll include him because he's such a clear RB1 in Philly with such a strong offensive line. And then Bijan Robinson is another guy I'd like to include. Competent offensive coordinator, less than stellar receiving room. It's not bad by any means. Obviously, you've got Kyle Pitts, you've got Drake London, you've got a couple other guys that were added, Rondale Moore and such. But I think that he could definitely still make a run at it. I think he's talented enough. And then that's kind of it. And the list is short, but that's definitely what I expected going into this. It's a passing league, and not many teams make running the ball their identity unless their quarterback is part of it. And two of the teams here, their quarterback running is a huge part of their team. You got Jonathan Taylor on the Colts with Anthony Richardson, who is a huge rushing threat. And then Saquon Barkley on the Eagles with Jalen Hurts. He's still a big rushing threat at any point in the game, not just from the 1 yard line. As far as the O-line situation goes, the Colts and Eagles both had Pro Bowlers on their offensive line last year, multiple Pro Bowlers. And then the Falcons didn't have any, but they did have some pretty solid play. They were one of those offensive lines that I definitely heard talked about as like underrated, not amazing, but definitely not bad. And I think that, again, Bijan is talented enough to get past that. But I do think it's very unlikely that we see a 2,000-yard running back this season, especially with the way that the league is just becoming more and more of a passing centric league. And then also the fact that last year we didn't even see anybody crack 1,500. So I'm really not expecting to see anybody hit 2,000. But if it does happen, I do think it's going to be one of those three, or it could be my next favorite, which is Brees Hall, who doesn't really fit the bill injury wise, but he's a good running back on a team who needs to be careful about their old man quarterback. So they could definitely focus the run game a little bit more. I don't really think they will, and I think that if anything, he may crack 2,000 all-purpose yards, but it would be with a lot of receiving upside and receiving work in there. But to me, he's a very clear-cut RB1 on an offense that needs an identity after last year with their quarterback out for the season. They just kind of looked lackluster. So definitely let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know who your favorite running back is and if you think that they can crack 2,000, if you think anybody will. And then predict the leader in rushing yards next season. You don't have to give me a number or anything, but I'd like to know who everybody thinks is the best running back in the NFL. A guy I didn't really talk about too much is Derrick Henry, who obviously joined the Ravens, and that's another team with the quarterback as a rushing threat, and they've had some pretty good running back play in the past. But the reason I didn't include him here, aside from just age, is that Keaton Mitchell is definitely going to be taking some of his snaps just because of the talent that he has. And then Justice Hill as well played pretty well last season. So I wouldn't be surprised if Derrick Henry was in more of a running back by committee and less of a, carry the ball 350 times this season, Derrick. So that's why I didn't include him. But as I was saying, let me know your thoughts. Give me some ideas for some other videos of this nature if you enjoyed these. And drop a like, comment down below. I always respond to everybody, or I try to at least. So it's all love. And with that, deuces.